The first issue of Rook Exodus Volume 2 is finally here.
Peak fiction incoming.
Rook Exodus, one of the coolest stories that I introduced you guys to last year, but I know there are still many of you guys who have no clue who this character is, so if you don't want to go watch the videos that I made on the 6 previous issues that take place before the issue that we're about to cover, here's a quick little explanation of what Rook Exodus is about. So this story takes place on a planet called Exodus that was purchased by a company called Better World, who promised that Exodus was humanity's second chance at prosperity due to the fact that Earth was drained of its resources. Because Exodus didn't have the same environment as Earth though, everything on it was artificial. The clean air and water, the beautiful climate, and the planet's wildlife that was controlled by Better World employees known as Wardens. Now, all of those artificial things ran on something called the World Engine, which is basically a massive machine responsible for keeping the entire planet of Exodus inhabitable. But eventually the World Engine began failing, causing Exodus to slowly revert back into the barren wasteland that it used to be, and resulting in Better World abandoning the planet altogether while leaving the Wardens behind. Now, the main character Rook is bonded with crows, but unlike other Wardens, his connection was weak. The crows resisted him, broke his control, and didn't show him any sort of loyalty or respect. In addition to that, he's always kind of struggled being confident in his own identity, questioning if he was truly a leader or just someone who always ran away when things got hard. But he was eventually pulled into conflict with a villain known as Ursaw, who commanded the Bears and also killed his best friend named Swine because he was going after all the other Wardens on the planet to take possession of their helmets so he could build an unstoppable army. Because he wanted control of something called the Wildlife Grid, which is basically a system that runs off of the World Engine, capable of locating every Warden on the planet. But it's later revealed that the real reason he wanted the Wildlife Grid was because he actually worked for Better World. Anyways, throughout the first 6 issues, Rook teamed up with a girl named Donica, who is the Warden of the Wolves, and a guy named Carapace that controls the turtles. And during their time working together, they faced a great number of challenges. Donica fought her former student Ka, who joined Ursaw's forces. Rook was hurled off of a dam by Ursaw and left for dead, but luckily he was saved by a boar named Pumbaa, and Carapace barely survived when he was attacked by Ursaw. Nevertheless, at Rook's lowest point in the story, he hallucinated his past and confronted the truth about himself, that he had always chosen flight over fight. But by finally opening up to his flock and sharing his fears, he gained their trust. For the first time ever, the crows willingly fought alongside him, not because of their connection through the helmet, but because they genuinely wanted to help him, which they would later prove by swarming to his side when he wasn't even wearing the helmet, before overwhelming Ursaw with so much force that he fell off of his own ship, which is like 100 feet tall, allowing Rook and his friends to hold him in captivity to see if he would ever regain consciousness. But despite their victory, it wasn't without one last devastating revelation. Donica's father, who was Warden of the Wild Dogs and previously thought to be dead, was actually still alive, and he was the only person who knew how to repair the failing World Engine, but getting through to him wasn't gonna be an easy task because he had basically lost his mind due to something called instinct influence, which happens when a Warden lets the instincts of the animal they control take over their own instincts. This issue, on the other hand, picks up during a cold and snowy day in the middle of one of Exodus's artificial forests, as a deer that was all by itself drank some water out of a little stream. And while at first the setting was peaceful and the deer was unbothered, eventually it was startled and put on edge after hearing a strange noise off in the distance. And that's when none other than a roaring pack of dogs led by Donica's father Bloodhound came flying onto the scene out of some nearby trees, relentlessly pouncing towards the deer and repeatedly barking towards the deer in hopes of catching a meal. But eventually the deer managed using its hind legs to smack Bloodhound onto the ground before none other than Stag, aka the Warden of the Deers, revealed himself on a nearby tree branch before leaping down to Bloodhound's level and trying to strike him down with his blade. Because Bloodhound leapt out of the way before being struck though, it gave him the chance to activate his connection to the dogs, and immediately upon doing so, Stag found himself surrounded with absolutely nowhere to run. But instead of leaving things to fate and accepting defeat at the hands of another Warden, he then activated the connection between him and his animals, which is when a small but effective cluster of bucks came blasting onto the scene full force, jamming their antlers into one dog after another until him and Bloodhound could resume their battle. Wasting no time to take the initiative, Stag resorted to his Crimson Blade once again, gripping its handle with both of his hands before whipping it across his body in hopes of slashing it across Bloodhound's chest. But Bloodhound's reaction time was quicker than he anticipated, and before he could regain composure, enclosure, he was being tackled off the edge of a hill where him and Bloodhound would spend the next few moments exchanging blow after blow while rolling down to the bottom. But once they finally made it to the bottom, their clash was brought to a close because Bloodhound fled into the trees as soon as he got the chance because he was losing blood at a rapid pace. So as battle-tested adrenaline continued flooding his system, Stag took off into the woods as well, trying to catch on to Bloodhound's trail, but after running into a cliff that overlooked the forest, he wasn't able to do anything but aura farm until finding a little piece of fur that Bloodhound was wearing. After that, our story switches things over to the top of another snowy mountain as none other than our main character Rook, followed by his massive flock of ravens, scoped out a nearby campsite while talking to Carapace over the comms. And according to Carapace, this campsite was inhabited by another warden named Matterhorn who was in control of the goats, but getting her on their side and getting her to trust Rook wasn't going to be an easy task because apparently she was just as stubborn as the goats she had control over. Nevertheless, along with his ravens, Rook had also brought Pumbaa along for this journey because after literally saving Rook's life back in issue 5, making him a permanent member of the family just felt like the right thing to do. As they continued making their way up the mountain though, Rook began reminiscing on the past and thinking about everything that he had to go through to get where he was today, because he'd come a very long way from the farm he was raised on back on Earth with his father. And while most of the stuff on this page is just summarizing what we already explained in the beginning of the video, one of the things that's worth taking note of is that Rook still hasn't gained the trust of Carapace, because if you don't remember, in the beginning of the first volume, Rook was building a rocket ship and trying to abandon Exodus, while Carapace and Donica wanted nothing more than to save Exodus. And it was only up until recently, after they overcame the threat of Ursaw, that Rook committed to joining their cause. After that though, we see Matterhorn herself arguing with a group of her goats inside of her tent while going over a map of Exodus in hopes of finding the world engine. But upon Rook stepping inside of her tent, she immediately went into defense mode by holding him at gunpoint because she assumed he was sent by Ursaw. So Rook put his hands into the air, assuring her that things were quite the opposite because he was actually the man responsible for stopping Ursaw. Knowing that gaining her trust wasn't going to be so easy though, he'd then remove his helmet and properly introduce himself, expressing that he was in desperate need of her help so they could save their dying planet. As stated by Matterhorn though, convincing her was going to take some work, which was mainly the fault of her goats. So Rook expressed that he didn't blame her skepticism given the state of their world right now, but he wanted her to know that he was genuinely fighting for a righteous cause, indicating that he was working with two other wardens who she was familiar with and that they wanted to make her a part of the team because Carapace knew she was up in these mountains looking for the world engine with a team of engineers. But upon asking her if she was able to pinpoint its location yet, she implied that her and her goats still didn't trust him. So Rook proposed that she talk to Carapace directly so she could see that their intentions were pure, before indicating that they were currently in possession of the wildlife grid, which meant that they could access the location of every single warden on the planet. However, despite having all of their locations, they still weren't able to communicate with all of the wardens without physically activating the links on their helmets. So if she was willing to let him do that, then she could be a part of their group and her and Carapace could have a conversation. Moments later though, before she could even give him an answer, they were interrupted when Pumbaa came barging into the tent while knocking stuff all over the place. And according to Rook, it was because he was super hungry and scavenging for food as a result of their long journey. But knowing that Pumbaa was one of Swine's boars, Matterhorn was confused as to why he was even with Rook in the first place. So Rook gave her the unfortunate news that Swine fell at the hands of Ursaw, so now Pumbaa was his responsibility. And that's when Matterhorn finally took off her helmet, agreeing to let him activate the link to their communication system so Carapace could explain what was going on. Our story then switches things over to the Oasis, which is basically Carapace's fortress protected by his giant battle tortoises, and it's here that Carapace himself tells Rook that he needs to be quicker with his execution while reaching the other wardens, before stating that he needed to make sure Matterhorn wasn't wearing the helmet while it connected to the wildlife grid because the feedback from it could be very dangerous. Nevertheless, after giving her the rundown on everything, Matterhorn began doubting how effective their strategy was, stating that establishing connections with all the other wardens one by one was going to be way too slow. However, according to Rook, as of right now, he just didn't know a faster way. But what he did know was that they needed to work as quickly as possible because some of the helmets had fallen into the wrong hands and some of the wardens themselves had decided to go rogue. So Matterhorn continued listening to Carapace explain over the comms how they were going to start executing things, but eventually she grew annoyed and started feeling like she was being lectured, so Rook implied that maybe she'd have an easier time listening to Dire Wolf, indicating that she wasn't far from them and stating that she was in the midst of tracking down her father Bloodhound Bloodhound because he was the only one who could fix the world engine. But after putting her helmet back on, Matterhorn began explaining that she was all too familiar with Bloodhound and that he couldn't be saved. He was too far gone after the instinct influence took over his mind. Rook was hopeful that they could save his mind though, and believed that they didn't really have any other option because again, he was the only one with experience with the world engine. However, that's when Matterhorn expressed that if Donica was closing in on his location, they needed to get to her as fast as humanly possible because Rook didn't understand how dangerous Bloodhound was, stressing that he killed every single engineer on her team that was trying to pinpoint the world engine's location. And that's when our story jumps over to Dire Wolf, confronting Bloodhound himself while accompanied by her pack of wolves. Desperate to get through to him, she then removed her helmet while emphasizing that she was his daughter and stating that she was there to help. But as tears ran down her cheeks, it was clear that not a single ounce of humanity inhabited Bloodhound's body, because right after staring her down without saying a single word, he then took things a step even further by tackling her onto the ground, commanding his dogs to attack her wolves, and then trying to end her life. But before he could continue the rampage, a massive trap door hatch opened up beneath them, causing Bloodhound to fall inside, which is when none other than Arachnid, the warden of the spiders, expressed that Bloodhound shouldn't have came here, but he was extremely happy that he did. But sadly, that's when our issue comes to an end. But if you guys want to see what happens with Rook Exodus next, let me know in the comments down below.